A young man lies dying in a house in Naples, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that consumed his life. It's June 1837, and Giacomo Leopardi, the poet who dared to argue that nature itself was indifferent to human suffering and that happiness was structurally, permanently out of reach, knows his time is ending. He's 38 years old. He spent those years in exile of a different kind, not political exile, but the exile of a body that refused to cooperate, a town that refused to release him, a philosophy so bleak that polite society refused to accept it. His poems have been admired by a small circle. His prose has made the Catholic establishment deeply uncomfortable. But his ideas have already begun travelling farther than he ever managed to, shaping how the century thinks about suffering, illusion. What honest thought actually costs? This is the story of how a hunched, half-blind child from a provincial backwater in the Papal States became the greatest Italian poet of the 19th century, one of the most radical philosophical minds that century produced. That consciousness is not a gift but a wound, and if you think that conclusion is merely the self-pity of a sick man, consider this. The philosophy Leopardi built in obscurity would draw the admiration of Nietzsche. His notebook, kept across 15 years and nearly 5,000 pages, would be recognized when finally translated in full as one of the most systematically modern philosophical documents in any European language. His poems, compressed and formally precise, would be read 2 centuries later as some of the deepest lyrics in the Western tradition. A generation of Italian writers would claim him as their predecessor. He would do all of this without a university, without a mentor for most of his life, without a single year of unbroken physical health, without ever genuinely escaping the small town where he was born. But the man who constructed these ideas was no brooding romantic in the usual sense. He wasn't theatrical. He wasn't reckless. He was cautious, methodical, and often desperate. He published his most challenging work into a culture unprepared to receive it. He tried once to flee his hometown by forging documents and was caught by his own father. He fell in love with a married woman and wrote it down in a diary rather than act. How does someone so constrained produce philosophy so vast? How does a man who spent his entire life inside a single radius of experience arrive at conclusions that feel universal rather than merely personal? The answer lies in a life stranger and more painful than any simplified account of it can capture. Recanati was a small town in the Marche region, and it gave Leopardi everything except freedom. His father's library gave him the ancient world in its entirety. His body gave him suffering in reliable, unrelenting quantities. His isolation gave him no choice but to go inward, farther than most people ever go, until what he found there wasn't comfort, but clarity. The ideas that came out of that process would outlast the empires reorganizing themselves around him while he sat reading by candlelight. He never traveled freely. He never loved successfully. He never enjoyed what most people would recognize as a normal life. But the man who built these ideas out of pure suffering was no romantic hero in the conventional sense. He was small, sick, radically, stubbornly alive in his mind, even as his body came apart. Recanati was the kind of Italian town where the ambitions of the outside world arrived late, if they arrived at all. It sat in the Marche region of central Italy, in the heart of the Papal States, a small hill town of perhaps 5,000 souls surrounded by countryside that changed very slowly, and a church establishment that changed even more slowly. Napoleon had shaken Europe to its foundations. The old certainties of dynasty and divine right had been challenged, dismantled, argued over in capital cities from Paris to Vienna. But in Recanati, the reverberations of all that arrived muffled, softened by distance and by the active conservatism of a town that preferred its arrangements as they were. The Enlightenment ideas circulating through European salons had barely penetrated its narrow streets. The post-Napoleonic debate about liberty, nationalism, and the rights of peoples was here largely theoretical. Life in Recanati moved according to the rhythms of the church calendar, the agricultural seasons, the slow consolidation of local families who had held the same positions for generations. Into this atmosphere, on June 29th, 1798, Giacomo Leopardi was born. His family was the most prominent in town. That meant, in the context of Recanati, a great deal and very little at the same time. The Leopardis were noble. They had a palazzo. They had a name that commanded local respect. What they no longer quite had by the time Giacomo arrived was money. His father, Count Monaldo Leopardi, had seen to that. Monaldo was a man of genuine intellectual passion and almost total financial recklessness. He loved books above nearly everything else. He had spent what the family had, and a great deal it didn't have, acquiring them. The library he assembled in the palazzo was extraordinary, one of the finest private collections in the Papal States. The balance sheets were catastrophic. His gambling debts and accumulated obligations had brought the family to the edge of ruin. Monaldo, faced with the consequences of his own appetites, eventually surrendered control of the family finances entirely to his wife. Adelaide Antitti was the kind of woman who could be described as formidable without it being entirely a compliment. She was cold, methodical, and absolutely focused on one task: rebuilding the family's financial position. She managed the household with an austerity that bordered on severity. Warmth was not a quality she cultivated. Her children's emotional lives were not, by any visible evidence, a priority. She was, by the standards of her time and class, doing what was necessary, and she was doing it competently. That made it hard to simply condemn her. But the result, for the children growing up inside that palazzo, was a domestic environment that was simultaneously protective and suffocating, religiously disciplined in a way that left almost no room for the kind of spontaneous joy that children require. Food was carefully rationed, expenses were controlled, every indulgence was weighed against the larger project of financial survival. Count Monaldo, for his part, had retreated into reaction. He was a committed political conservative, suspicious of the new ideas flowing in from post-revolutionary France, hostile to liberalism and nationalism in all their forms. His intellectual passions were genuine but narrow. He read widely, he wrote, he opined, and he did all of it from a position of settled certainty that the old order, the papal authority, the hierarchies of faith and rank, were not merely convenient but correct. He was not a cruel man. He had real affection for his children. But his world was a closed one, and he had no particular interest in opening it. The household, then, was a place of extraordinary paradox. There was the library, vast, magnificent, full of precisely the books that could carry a curious mind anywhere it wished to go. And there was the family itself, arranged around principles of economy, obedience, religious observance that pressed inward from every direction. The prayers were regular. The supervision was constant. The sense that certain questions were not to be asked was pervasive. Within these walls, Giacomo had two companions who mattered: his younger brother Carlo and his sister Paolina. The three children formed a small enclosed world inside the larger enclosure of the palazzo and the town. Carlo was close to Giacomo in age and temperament. The two would remain in correspondence for the rest of Giacomo's life, exchanging letters of a frankness he rarely showed elsewhere. Paolina was intellectually curious in ways that the family's expectations for a daughter made difficult to sustain. They were, all three of them, children who understood from an early age that the world available to them was considerably smaller than the world that existed. Recanati itself reinforced this at every turn. The town offered no intellectual stimulation commensurate with what was developing inside Giacomo's mind. There were no peers of his ability, no teachers who could keep up with him, no institutions that could channel what he was becoming. The isolation was not merely geographical, it was cultural, social, and in the deepest sense, spiritual. The boy who would one day write about the infinite found himself confined from the very beginning by walls on every side. The Leopardi Palazzo had something that would save Giacomo and destroy him in equal measure: one of the finest private libraries in the Papal States. Count Monaldo had spent years assembling it, accumulating volumes with an enthusiasm that bore no relationship to the family's actual finances. There were thousands of books, classical texts, theological treatises, works of natural philosophy, history, poetry, philology, gathered from booksellers across Italy, while Adelaide managed the accounts and said nothing, or said everything, depending on the year. The library was Monaldo's great extravagance, the one place where his reactionary temperament and his genuine love of learning converged into something real. For Giacomo, it was simply the world. He entered it very young, before most children his age had progressed beyond basic primers. Giacomo was moving through the shelves with a purposefulness that the household tutors found difficult to keep up with. Count Monaldo had arranged for instruction in the usual subjects: Latin grammar, basic rhetoric, the foundational religious texts. The tutors were competent men. They simply weren't prepared for what they encountered. Giacomo didn't absorb material the way other children did, receiving it in portions and practicing until it settled. He consumed it. He finished exercises before they were assigned. He returned from lessons having independently worked through problems the tutor had intended to cover the following week. The pace was disorienting for everyone involved. Latin came first, and it came quickly. By 10, he was reading it with fluency, not merely translating sentences, but moving through classical texts as a reader, tracking argument and style. Greek followed. This was the harder achievement. Greek required a different kind of mental effort, a willingness to rebuild fundamental assumptions about how language could be structured. Giacomo was 12 when he began it seriously, and was reading Homer's original Greek within a year. Visitors to the palazzo who encountered him during this period left accounts that all contained the same quality of disbelief. Here was a child, physically small and pale from long hours indoors, who could discuss Thucydides in the original with the composure of a university professor. He didn't stop at Greek. Hebrew came next, studied largely without formal instruction, worked out through grammatical texts and scriptural commentary available in the library. Then French, which he acquired quickly enough that he was reading French philosophical literature with ease by his early teens. Spanish followed, English. He approached each new language as a problem to be solved, and solved it, then moved directly into reading whatever the language could offer him. This wasn't the ordinary precocity of a clever child who learns quickly. It was something structurally different, a mind that seemed to experience no resistance between encountering a linguistic system and internalizing it completely. What's striking, looking at this period from the outside, is the solitude of it. There was no school. There were no peers. The intellectual companionship available in the palazzo was limited to his father, who was learned but not equipped to match where Giacomo was going. The tutors, who fell further behind with each passing season. His siblings Carlo and Paolina were close to him emotionally, genuinely fond of each other in the way that children confined together become. But they weren't his intellectual equals. Giacomo understood this without cruelty, simply as a fact of his situation. He was alone in the library. The library was enormous, and that was the shape of his education. He began translating in earnest around age 14. The choice of texts was not modest. He worked through the first book of Homer's Odyssey in Italian, producing a version that showed not merely technical competence, but genuine sensitivity to the rhythm and weight of Homeric verse. He translated the second book of Virgil's Aeneid. These were texts that classical scholars spent careers annotating. Giacomo approached them as a teenager with no formal university preparation, no seminar guidance, no access to the community of scholarship that ordinarily surrounds such work. He had the texts, the grammars, the commentaries available in the library. His own intelligence, and he produced translations that visitors who examined them found difficult to reconcile with the age of the person who had made them. The palazzo received occasional learned visitors, men of letters, ecclesiastical scholars, gentlemen with classical interests, who called on Count Monaldo. When they encountered Giacomo, the responses were uniform: astonishment, followed by a kind of unease. There's something in the accounts that suggests the visitors didn't quite know how to position what they were seeing. A prodigy is one thing. A child who engages with classical scholarship at the level of a mature professional is something else. It produces a social discomfort that the accounts don't name directly, but register nonetheless. Giacomo was not performing precocity for their benefit. He was simply continuing the work he did every day. The work happened to exceed everything they expected. The library shaped him in ways that couldn't be separated from each other. It gave him a classical education of extraordinary depth and range, the kind of formation that had produced the greatest humanist scholars of earlier centuries. It also gave him a childhood without childhood's ordinary textures, without the casual society of peers, without the friction of institutional learning, without any context in which his abilities were unremarkable. He grew up measured only against the dead. The ancient authors were his companions. They set a standard. He met it, and there was no one around him who could tell him what that cost. By the time he was 14, he had already exhausted the resources of every tutor his father could find. What Leopardi did between the ages of 12 and 19 has no real parallel in the history of European letters. Most prodigies burn bright for a season and then settle into something more ordinary. Leopardi did not settle. He accelerated. The library that had shaped his earliest years became in his adolescence something closer to an obsession, a place he retreated to before dawn and left only when the candles had burned down entirely. He called this period, in his own words, studio matto e disperatissimo, mad and most desperate studying. The phrase sounds romantic from a distance. It was not romantic, it was a kind of consuming, and what it consumed was him. The hours were punishing. He worked through the night regularly, sleeping only when exhaustion made it impossible to continue. He translated, composed, annotated, analysed. He moved through classical texts with the systematic intensity of someone trying to master not just a language, but an entire civilization at once. Greek historians, Latin poets, ancient rhetorical treatises. He absorbed them all and then turned around and produced original scholarly commentary of a quality that would have impressed a trained academic. He was 13, then 14, then 15. The pace did not slow. If anything, it intensified, because the alternative was Recanati itself, and the palazzo, and the silence of a household that offered very little beyond books to a boy of his particular interior life. The physical cost announced itself gradually, then all at once. Somewhere in these years his spine began to curve. The condition was probably Pott's disease, tuberculosis of the spine, or possibly ankylosing spondylitis. Physicians then, and scholars later, have debated the precise diagnosis, but the effects were beyond dispute. His back bent. His stature, already modest, contracted further. By the time he was in his late teens, he stood barely 4.5 feet tall, and the curvature was visible and permanent. He had been born into a body that carried inherited fragility. Many in his family had suffered from serious ailments and physical abnormalities, but the hours bent over books in poorly heated rooms, working by weak candlelight, almost certainly accelerated what would have come anyway. Then there were his eyes. The eye problems began early and grew worse with each passing year. There were extended periods when reading became impossible. The very activity that constituted his entire existence, taken away from him for weeks at a time. He pushed through when he could. When he couldn't, he sat in a kind of enforced idleness that he found more agonizing than pain. For someone whose mind was always running at full speed, being unable to engage with books was not rest. It was a different kind of suffering. The eyes never fully recovered. They remained one of the persistent vulnerabilities of his life, a limit he ran up against again and again. The secondary ailments multiplied. Asthma made breathing laboured. Digestive problems became chronic and severe enough to constrain what he could eat and how he could move. Insomnia threaded through everything, making the nights that had once belonged to scholarship increasingly restless and exhausting. He developed sensitivities to cold that would dictate where he could live for the rest of his short life. The body he had inherited was fragile to begin with. The body he had built through 7 years of relentless studying was something approaching a ruin. He was not yet 20. What makes this period so difficult to think about clearly is the paradox at its centre. The studies were his escape. They were the one mechanism that made Recanati survivable, the one path he could see toward a world larger than the palazzo and the provincial streets outside it. To master Greek was to enter Athens. To translate Virgil was to move inside a civilization that had produced something lasting and magnificent. The library was his window, and studying was the only way to open it wider. But every hour of study was also an hour of physical damage, accumulating silently until the damage became impossible to ignore. The escape route and the trap were the same thing. He knew this, or came to know it, and kept studying anyway, because there was nothing else. He produced an extraordinary volume of work in these years: philological treatises, translations, original poetry in multiple forms, scholarly commentaries on ancient texts that demonstrated not just comprehension, but genuine critical intelligence. Visitors to the palazzo who encountered his work came away shaken by the gap between the age of the author and the maturity of the scholarship. One contemporary described the effect as unsettling. The writing looked like the product of a long career, and the person who had written it was a teenager in a provincial Italian town who had essentially never left home. His father, whatever his emotional limitations, understood what he was witnessing and made a point of showing the work to anyone who might recognize its significance. The boy who had entered the library at 12 and looking for escape emerged at 19 as something the Italian literary world had no real category for. He was not a student because no institution had trained him. He was not yet publicly a poet because the major poems were still ahead. He was a solitary intelligence, formed entirely by his own effort, carrying in his head a quantity of classical knowledge that most scholars would have been proud to have assembled over an entire professional life, and carrying in his body the consequences of having assembled it the way he had. He had taught himself more than most scholars would accumulate in a lifetime, and he had paid for it with his body. In 1816, something shifted. For years, Leopardi had moved through texts the way a surveyor moves through terrain, measuring, cataloguing, annotating. His scholarship was extraordinary, but it was the scholarship of accumulation. He translated Homer and Virgil with a precision that would have impressed a trained classicist. He wrote philological commentaries on ancient authors that nobody in Recanati had the learning to evaluate. He had built an enormous architecture of erudition inside the palazzo, and it was entirely, suffocatingly internal. What changed in 1816 was not his intelligence or his discipline. It was the direction those things were pointing. Leopardi himself gave this moment a name. He called it the passage from erudition to the beautiful. The phrase sounds neat, almost programmatic, but what it describes is a genuine transformation in how he understood his own purpose. The classical languages he had mastered weren't only instruments for recovering what the ancients had said. They were models for saying something himself. The difference was enormous. A scholar works backward toward a text. A poet works forward toward an expression that doesn't yet exist. His first serious poem in this new mode was L'appressamento della morte, The Approach of Death, written in 1816 when he was 17. The choice of form was deliberate and revealing. He wrote in terza rima, the interlocking three-line stanzas that Dante had used in the Commedia. This was not accidental borrowing. It was a declaration of lineage, a young poet placing himself consciously inside the great Italian tradition and testing whether his voice could sustain the weight of that connection. The poem itself is not yet fully his, The imagery is sometimes stiff, the philosophical movement not yet the fluid thing it would later become, but the impulse behind it, the desire to confront mortality directly, to make suffering into formal art rather than merely endure it. That impulse was already entirely Leopardi's own. In the same period, Leopardi entered a debate that was dividing literary Europe. The question was essentially this: should contemporary poetry follow the models of classical antiquity, or should it embrace the new Romantic movement that was transforming literature in Germany and England and spreading steadily into Italy? Leopardi took his position in a substantial critical essay, The discorso di un italiano attorno alla poesia romantica, a discourse on romantic poetry, written from the perspective of an Italian classicist. His answer was unambiguous. He sided with the ancients. This might seem strange, given what his poetry would eventually become. Leopardi is now read as one of the defining figures of Italian Romanticism. But his classicism was never simply conservative instinct. He understood the ancient poets as writers who had access to something modern civilization had lost: an immediacy of experience, a capacity for the kind of unreflective feeling that close engagement with nature and mortality produces. The Romantics, in his view, were reaching for that intensity through Teutonic fog and Gothic machinery. The better route was to learn from the Greeks and Romans who had actually possessed it. His argument was not that modernity should imitate the ancients, but that it should understand what the ancients understood. There was a philosophical edge to his classicism from the beginning. Then came 1818, and with it the two poems that first announced him to anyone paying attention beyond the walls of the Palazzo. All'Italia, to Italy, and Sopra il monumento di Dante, on the monument of Dante, were patriotic odes, on a scale he hadn't attempted before. Both lament the same thing: the distance between what Italy had been and what it had become. The ancient Romans, in Leopardi's rendering, possessed a heroic vitality that modern Italians had entirely forfeited. Their descendants occupied the same peninsula and spoke a descended language, but the connection felt severed. Italy was politically fragmented, culturally passive, subject to foreign powers that controlled it with barely disguised contempt. The poems call directly on ancient virtue. They name the battles where Romans died for something worth dying for. They ask, with a barely controlled fury, how a nation that produced such men could have arrived at such vacancy. It is important to understand what these poems are not. They are not the private meditations of a young man absorbed in his own suffering. They are public, rhetorical, addressed outward. They demand a response. Leopardi was not only writing about Italy, he was trying to act on it, to use verse as a form of civic pressure, to shame his contemporaries into something better. The fact that he was writing from a small room in Recanati, unable to walk freely in the world he was addressing, made the ambition more striking, not less. He was 18 years old. The voice was not yet fully his, but the ambition is enormous. The two patriotic odes that appeared in 1818 announced a poet who had found his voice, even if the world wasn't quite ready to listen. Pietro Giordani arrived at the Leopardi estate in 1817. For Giacomo, it was like a window opening in a room that had been sealed shut for years. Giordani was not an obscure figure. He was one of the most respected men of letters in Italy, a classicist, an essayist, a correspondent whose opinions carried weight in the literary circles of Milan and Florence. He had earned his reputation through decades of careful scholarship and a prose style that contemporaries admired for its precision and gravity. He was 40 years old when he came to Recanati. He was, by every measure, a man who had arrived. What drew him to a provincial backwater in the Papal States was curiosity about a name he had encountered in one of the patriotic odes of 1818, a name attached to work that struck him as extraordinary for any writer, let alone one who turned out to be a teenager confined to his father's library. The improbability of what followed is hard to overstate. Here was a celebrated scholar moving through the centres of Italian intellectual life, choosing to invest himself seriously in a 19-year-old who had never left Recanati, whose formal credentials amounted to nothing more than private study and a father's library. And here was Giacomo, who had spent years writing into a void, receiving for the first time the confirmation that his work was real and that the world capable of judging it had noticed. Their correspondence began almost immediately and became one of the great epistolary exchanges in Italian literary history. Leopardi wrote to Giordani with a candour that he had never permitted himself before. He described his isolation not as a complaint but as a fact. The particular texture of days spent reading and writing in a town where no one around him had any particular interest in what occupied his mind. He described his ambitions with the same frankness. He wanted to be part of something larger than Recanati, to belong to the intellectual life of his time, to produce work that would survive. He was not falsely modest. He knew what he was capable of, and he said so. What Giordani gave back was something Leopardi had never received in quite this form. It wasn't simply praise, though the praise was genuine and specific. Giordani identified precisely what was remarkable about the early poems. The compression, the classical discipline applied to intensely personal material. It was recognition. Giordani treated him as a peer. He argued with him, pushed back on certain positions, suggested readings, asked questions that assumed a serious intellect on the other side. For a young man who had spent years in a household where his gifts were acknowledged largely as curiosities and his suffering was managed as an inconvenience, this was not a small thing. The letters Leopardi sent during this period reveal the scale of what he had been holding. He wrote about the loneliness with an analytical clarity that is almost painful to read, not wallowing, but dissecting, the way a naturalist might describe a specimen. He understood his own situation with terrible precision. He was 20 years old, brilliant beyond any reasonable measure, physically deteriorating, surrounded by a family that loved him in the ways it was capable of and could not reach him where he actually lived. Giordani could not change any of this, but he could see it and say that he saw it. That was more than anyone had done before. There were limits to what the friendship could offer, and Leopardi understood them clearly enough. Letters arrived and were answered. Encouragement accumulated, but the palazzo walls were still there when Leopardi set down his pen. His eyesight still worsened by the month. His back still curved under whatever it was that was slowly reshaping his skeleton. His father's house was still his father's house. The same rooms, the same routines, the same distance from everything he wanted to reach. Giordani could confirm that Florence existed, that Milan existed, that there were rooms full of people who would read what Leopardi wrote. He could not put Giacomo in those rooms. And yet the confirmation mattered more than it might seem from the outside. Before Giordani, the outside world was largely theoretical, something Leopardi could read about and imagine, but had no direct evidence was accessible to him personally. After Giordani, it was real in a way it hadn't been before. Someone from that world had come to Recanati and gone away telling people what he'd found there. That changed the nature of the waiting. It made the isolation more bearable and less bearable simultaneously. More bearable because there was proof the world existed, less bearable because the proof only sharpened the desire to reach it. Giordani continued to correspond with him for years, through the difficult periods that followed, through the worsening health and the failed escape attempt still to come. The friendship outlasted the immediate intensity of its first phase, but nothing that came after quite replicated the shock of that first encounter, the experience of being seen with full clarity by someone who had no obligation to look. For the first time in his life, Leopardi had someone who saw him not as a curiosity or a burden, but as a mind worth taking seriously. In 1817, Leopardi fell in love for the first time. He handled it the way he handled everything. He wrote it down, The woman was Gertrude Cassi Lazzari, a married cousin who came to stay at the palazzo for a few days in the autumn of that year. She was older than him, educated, and entirely unavailable. She was also, for Giacomo, the first human being outside his family who seemed to offer something that books alone could not. He was 19. He had spent 7 years destroying his body in a library. He had never been in a position to want anything from another person before. The experience hit him with a force that surprised even someone as self-aware as he was becoming. He documented it immediately. The prose diary he kept during those days, later known as the Diario d'Amore, records the encounter with a clinical precision that barely conceals the emotion underneath. Every detail of her presence in the house, the way she spoke, the hours when she was near, and the hours when she was not. The poem that followed, Il primo amore, extended the meditation further. What Leopardi was doing in both pieces was less the work of a lovesick young man than of a philosopher who had stumbled onto an irreversible discovery. That desire, by its nature, reaches towards something it cannot hold. Gertrude left. The wanting remained, and what remained after the wanting was a new understanding of how the mind is built. This was the condition from which the Zibaldone grew. The notebook had begun earlier in the same year. It would continue until 1832. 15 years, nearly 5,000 pages. The word Zibaldone means something like a miscellany, a hodgepodge, which understates what it actually is. The Zibaldone is simultaneously a philosophical journal, a linguistic workbook, an archive of aesthetic theory. One of the most intimate personal documents in Italian literature. On a single page, Leopardi might move from a technical analysis of Latin syntax to a reflection on the nature of beauty, to an observation about why ancient peoples were happier than modern ones, to a note about a particular quality of afternoon light. The connections between these thoughts are not always explicit. They accumulate instead, the way sediment accumulates, and over time a structure emerges. What the early entries reveal is a mind in the process of discovering itself. Leopardi had spent years acquiring knowledge. Now he was beginning to make something of it. The friendship with Pietro Giordani had given him a correspondent who took his ideas seriously. That validation had loosened something. He wrote in the notebook with a freedom he hadn't permitted himself before. He disagreed with the received positions. He tested arguments against each other without committing to either. He observed his own states of mind with the same rigour he brought to classical texts. The love for Gertrude became one of those states to examine. What it had shown him, he came to believe, was structural rather than personal. The experience of wanting something completely and being denied it was not a misfortune that had happened to him. It was a demonstration of something universal. The mind reaches, the world does not meet it. That gap is not an accident, not a failure of circumstance that better luck might have corrected. It is the permanent condition of conscious experience. The Zibaldone became, among other things, the place where Leopardi worked this out in full. There was another figure who entered that same year, though her significance would not become clear until much later. Teresa Fattorini was the daughter of the Leopardi family's coachman. She was young, healthy in the ordinary way that Giacomo was not. She moved through the periphery of his daily life at the palazzo with the easy unself-consciousness of someone who has not yet learned to look at existence too closely. He noticed her. He watched her the way a person who lives mostly in his mind watches those who seem entirely at home in their bodies. She contracted tuberculosis. She died young. Her death was, at the time, one more instance of the loss that had already become a recurring theme in his thinking, another demonstration that youth and beauty were not protected by their own existence. He did not write about her immediately. She was not yet a subject, but she was entering the part of his mind that would eventually become his greatest poems, the place where particular people become figures for something larger than themselves. A decade later, she would surface in A Sylvia as the image of everything promising that perishes before it is fulfilled. In 1817, she was simply present, a young woman alive in the same house, the same courtyard, the same provincial town, while Leopardi sat at his desk and wrote, and he kept writing. The Zibaldone grew not as a project with a shape planned in advance, but as the record of a mind that had no other adequate outlet. Every encounter, every frustration, every philosophical problem that would not resolve itself found its way into those pages. The notebook kept growing, year after year, accumulating thoughts like sediment. What it would eventually contain was nothing less than the full architecture of one of the 19th century's most radical minds. By 1819, the walls had closed in completely. Leopardi was 20 years old, and he had not left Recanati in any meaningful way. He had been to the local church along the familiar streets, back to the palazzo. The wider world existed in books and in the letters he exchanged with Giordani. But those were representations of life, not life itself. He had watched year after year pass without change, while his body deteriorated and his intellectual ambitions pressed harder against a situation that offered them no outlet. By the time winter turned to spring in 1819, he had decided he could not stay. The plan he devised was straightforward in its desperation. He would obtain a passport through false pretenses, representing his intentions to the local authorities in terms that would not raise his father's suspicion. The details required careful handling. Recanati was a small place, and Count Monaldo had connections that reached into most of its administrative corners. Giacomo proceeded cautiously, securing the documents piece by piece, keeping the plan hidden from the household. What he intended to do once he was clear of the town isn't entirely certain. The point was escape first. The destination could be sorted afterward. It didn't work. His father discovered the plan before it could be set in motion. How exactly the interception happened isn't recorded in precise detail, but the result was unambiguous. The passport was revoked, the attempt was over. Giacomo was back inside the palazzo under closer supervision than before. Count Monaldo was not a cruel man in any simple sense. He genuinely believed his son needed protection, that the world outside was too harsh for someone of Giacomo's physical fragility. But that belief, however sincerely held, functioned as a cage. The surveillance intensified. The family watched him more carefully. The distance between father and son, which had been growing for years, widened into something harder to bridge. What the failed escape did to Leopardi's inner life was more consequential than anything external. He had risked something concrete and lost. He had made a direct claim on his own freedom and been turned back. The experience confirmed what some part of him had already suspected, that he was not going to move through life the way other men did, accumulating experience, forming attachments, testing himself against the ordinary world. He was going to remain where he was. That recognition was not resignation, it was something more corrosive, a hardening of his sense that he existed at a permanent remove from the circuits of happiness that seemed to run through other people's lives, without difficulty. Then his eyes failed. It had been coming for years. The long hours of reading and writing by poor light had taken their toll gradually. But in 1819, the deterioration became acute. For months, Leopardi could not read. He could not write. The library that had been his entire world, his escape and his education, and his one reliable source of anything approaching joy, was suddenly unavailable to him. He sat in rooms he knew by heart, unable to do the one thing that had always given him a reason to get through the day. The enforced stillness drove him inward in ways that no amount of voluntary reflection could have managed. When you remove the books, the notebooks, the external scaffolding of thought, what remains is the mind working on itself, over what it already contains, following chains of reasoning into whatever darkness they open onto. What Leopardi found in that darkness was not rest. It was not the peaceful void that religious traditions sometimes describe as the fruit of contemplation. It was an abyss, a confrontation with the basic structure of consciousness, stripped of distraction, revealing itself as something that desired endlessly and received almost nothing in return. The suffering that he had been articulating in theoretical terms became, in those months of blindness, an immediate and unexampled physical fact. This would matter enormously for everything he wrote afterward. The philosophy that took shape in his notebooks over the following years was not built from books alone. It was built from experience, specifically from the experience of being cut off from books and left alone with the bare mechanics of existing. When Leopardi wrote later about the mind's inability to find satisfaction in anything the world actually provides, he was not extrapolating from an abstraction. He had sat in that room and felt it directly. His eyesight recovered enough eventually to allow him to read and write again. The philosophical implications of what he had confronted didn't recover. They settled into him permanently, and the Zibaldone grew denser and darker through the months that followed. He was back in the palazzo, more closely watched than ever. The bitterness that had been building for years hardened into something permanent. The philosophy that Leopardi arrived at after 1819 didn't come from nowhere. The failed escape, the months of blindness, the long confinement inside his own thoughts, all of it had been building towards something. What emerged was not a mood or a temperament, but a genuine philosophical system, worked out with the rigour of a trained scholar and the urgency of a man who believed his conclusions were a matter of survival. Scholars call this first phase historical pessimism. The label is useful even if it flattens something more complicated. The basic argument goes like this: human beings were once closer to nature, not in a primitive or brutish sense, but in the sense that they lived inside a set of illusions that nature herself provided. Courage, beauty, heroism, the feeling of love, the sense of belonging to something larger and more permanent than a single life. These were not truths about the world. They were gifts that nature extended to her children, because without them life would be unendurable. Ancient peoples fought bravely because they genuinely believed glory was real. They loved passionately because they had not yet analysed love into its components and found it wanting. They looked at the sky and felt wonder rather than calculation. Reason was what ended all of this. As civilizations matured, as philosophy and science and rational inquiry developed, the illusions began to dissolve, and nothing replaced them. Reason could strip away the belief in glory, but it couldn't provide a substitute for glory. It could expose love as a biological compulsion, but it offered nothing to fill the space that love had occupied. The arc of human civilization in this reading was not progress, it was loss. Every step forward in knowledge was a step deeper into a kind of spiritual winter. Leopardi came to this partly through Rousseau, whose influence runs through the early pages of the Zibaldone like an underground current. Rousseau had argued that civilization corrupted natural man, that the move from primitive simplicity to social complexity had cost humanity something essential. Leopardi absorbed this and pushed it further. His ancient peoples were not noble savages. They were people who still had access to something real, not truth, but the experience of meaning, and the moderns had traded that access for clarity about a world that turned out to offer very little worth being clear about. What made this more than an intellectual exercise was how precisely it mapped onto his own life. He had educated himself with ferocious intensity, and the education had worked. He knew more than almost anyone around him. He could read Homer in Greek and feel the rhythms as a living thing, not a museum artifact. And yet that very knowledge had cost him the capacity for the kind of unreflective joy he could observe in people far less learned than himself. He watched the townspeople of Recanati, people he sometimes barely concealed his contempt for, and saw something in them he could not recover in himself. They could be happy in ways that his understanding made impossible. The festival on the village square moved them. The religious ceremony comforted them. He stood at the window and understood everything, and felt nothing of what they felt. This created a tension in Leopardi that he never fully resolved. He was honest enough to acknowledge it. He couldn't wish he had studied less. The studies were not a mistake he regretted in any simple way. They were the only thing that had made his life bearable, the only avenue through which he had managed to be fully himself rather than a provincial nobleman's sickly eldest son. His intellectual gifts were inseparable from his sense of his own worth. To wish them away would have been to wish himself away. And yet he could see, with the same analytical faculty he couldn't renounce, exactly what they had taken from him. His position in the literary debates of the period was similarly uncomfortable. In the classicism versus romanticism argument that preoccupied Italian letters in these years, Leopardi aligned himself firmly with the classicists, defending ancient poetry against what he saw as the modern romantics turned toward abstraction and sentiment. Ancient poetry had force because ancient poets had lived inside their illusions. They meant what they wrote. The moderns, for all their feeling, were performing emotions they had already half-analysed into incoherence. But Leopardi's deepest commitments didn't fit comfortably on the classical side either. He was not defending classical civilization because he believed it could or should be recovered. He was mourning it. The classicists wanted a programme. Leopardi had a funeral. The canzoni he was producing in these years, the patriotic odes, the philosophical hymns, carry the weight of this position. The voice in them reaches back toward ancient models, not out of imitation, but out of grief. He was writing from the wrong side of the divide he had identified, and he knew it. He had too much reason to write like someone who still had illusions. He had too many illusions left, or at least too much longing for them. To write like someone who had fully accepted their absence. Nature was still, in this first phase, a kind of mother, however distant and inconsistent. The enemy was human reason, the thing that stripped illusions away and left nothing in their place. In 1819, in the same months he was planning his escape, Leopardi wrote one of the most perfect short poems in any language. The poem is called L'Infinito, and it is 15 lines long. That's all. 15 lines, roughly 100 Italian words. Within that space, Leopardi managed something that philosophers had been attempting in thousands of pages, a precise account of what the human mind does when it reaches the edge of what it can perceive, and keeps reaching anyway. The poem begins simply. The poet is sitting on a hill he knows well, a familiar rise outside Recanati called the Colle dell'Infinito. A hedge blocks his view of the horizon. He can't see past it, and that obstruction, that ordinary, physical fact of a hedge cutting off his line of sight, becomes the engine of everything that follows. Because what the blocked view does is force his imagination inward and then outward into something vast. Unable to see the actual horizon, his mind constructs one that has no edge. He imagines spaces beyond what the eye can reach. Silence is deeper than any real silence. A time so old it precedes human memory entirely. The hedge, in other words, liberates him. The very thing that limits his vision is what makes the limitless thinkable. This is philosophically precise, not incidentally poetic. It captures a paradox that sits at the centre of Leopardi's entire way of thinking, that the human mind is built to desire what it cannot have, that the imagination is most alive precisely where experience stops, that this condition is both magnificent and devastating. The final lines are among the most discussed in Italian literary history. The poet hears wind moving through the trees. The sound pulls him back to the present. The contrast between that real small sound and the vast imagined silence he's just constructed is almost unbearable. He compares the experience to drowning, to shipwreck, except that the drowning is sweet. Naufragio è dolce in questo mare. Sweet shipwreck in this sea. The poem ends there, mid-dissolution, the self losing its boundaries in something it can't contain, and finding the loss pleasurable. That final line is not a resolution, it's a surrender, and Leopardi makes it sound like the most honest thing a mind can do What makes L'Infinito so remarkable is its compression. Nothing is wasted. Every word is load-bearing. Leopardi was 20 years old when he wrote it, in a house he despised, in a town he was trying to escape, with eyesight already damaged enough to make reading painful. The contrast between those circumstances and the poem's serene philosophical depth is difficult to account for. But the poem is also, quietly, a record of his situation. The hedge that blocks the view is real. The hill is real. The longing for something beyond what's available, that's real too. He transformed the specific geography of his confinement into a meditation that belongs to no particular place or time. The other poems from this period, the early Idilli and the first Canzoni, work by similar principles. Alla Luna is an address to the moon, that the poet asks if it remembers shining on him from the same hill a year before, when his life was different. The poem is formally quiet, almost understated, but underneath the restraint is the recognition that time moves in one direction only, that the moon is the same and the man is not. That memory is both comfort and wound. The suffering in it is real, but it has been processed into something formal and austere. La sera del dì di festa, the evening of the feast day, is perhaps the most emotionally direct of the group. A young woman sleeps after the celebrations. The town is quiet. The poet is alone, unable to sleep, aware that she doesn't think of him, following a chain of associations that moves from his personal exclusion, from happiness outward, to the fate of ancient civilizations that no longer exist. Other people celebrate and sleep. He lies awake. Nations rise and fall. The universe forgets them all. It sounds bleak stated plainly, but the poem doesn't feel bleak in the reading. It feels precise, like someone naming a condition that others have felt but not articulated. Each of these poems follows a similar movement. It begins in something small and specific. A hill, a moon, an evening, a woman singing at her window, and opens outward into something much larger and colder. The personal grief and the philosophical observation arrive together, inseparable, neither one illustrating the other, but both arising from the same source. That integration is what distinguishes Leopardi from his contemporaries. His suffering was not a posture. His philosophy was not an abstraction. Each bled into the other. The poems are the record of that bleeding, shaped into forms precise enough to last. These early poems were intimate in a way that his patriotic odes hadn't been. They announced a lyrical voice unlike anything Italy had produced since Petrarch. In November 1822, Leopardi finally got out. He was 24 years old. He had spent nearly every day of his life inside Recanati or inside the Palazzo. The journey to Rome, arranged through his uncle Carlo Antici, who had connections in the city, felt like the thing he had been waiting for since childhood. He had imagined Rome for years. He had read everything written about it. He had studied the classical world that produced it with a scholarly intensity most professional academics never match. Rome, in his mind, was where the serious intellectual life of Italy actually happened. What he found was something else entirely. Rome in 1822 was the capital of the Papal States, a city of ancient ruins and Baroque churches, an enormous administrative machinery devoted to maintaining the power of the Church over central Italy. The streets were full of priests and pilgrims. The salons were full of courtiers. The intellectual life, to the extent it existed at all, moved according to social calculations that had nothing to do with ideas. The people Leopardi met through his uncle were well connected, comfortable, almost entirely uninterested in the questions that had consumed him since he was 12 years old. He had expected a city alive with philosophical argument. He found patronage networks and polite conversation. The church hierarchy he encountered confirmed rather than softened his growing suspicion that institutional religion was fundamentally dishonest. These were not men animated by faith. They were men managing power. They did it with the practiced smoothness of people who had been doing it for a very long time. Leopardi had grown up in a household of genuine, if suffocating, Catholic piety. His father's religious convictions were real, however reactionary their political expression. What he saw in Rome was something different, a religious apparatus that had learned to wear conviction as a costume. It left him colder than ever toward the consolations that religion offered ordinary people. The ruins were worse. He had expected them to be magnificent. They were. But magnificence was not what they communicated to someone with Leopardi's philosophical framework already in place. What the ruins of the Forum, the Colosseum, the Palatine Hill communicated was loss on a scale that made personal suffering seem almost trivial by comparison. Here was the physical evidence of everything that human civilization had once built and then failed to keep. The greatest empire the Western world had ever produced had left behind broken columns and overgrown foundations. If Rome could fall, and Rome clearly had, then nothing was exempt from time's indifference. The ruins didn't inspire him, they confirmed him. It was in this frame of mind that he visited the tomb of Torquato Tasso, the great Renaissance poet buried at Sant'Onofrio on the Janiculum Hill. Tasso had died in 1595 on the eve of receiving the laurel crown that would have officially recognized him as the greatest poet of his age, recognition that arrived too late to mean anything to the man himself. He had spent years imprisoned in a hospital for the insane. His genius had been real. His suffering had been real. The world had rewarded him with confinement and neglect until it was too late to matter. Leopardi stood at that tomb and felt something he recognized. The identification was not sentimental. It was precise. Here was the pattern. A man of genuine intellectual gifts, destroyed by circumstances his talent could not overcome. Celebrated only after the circumstances had done their work. He would write about Tasso more than once in the years that followed. The visits stayed with him. He was writing during the Roman months as well, though not yet the intimate lyrical poems that had emerged in 1819 and 1820. The poem written around this period for his sister Paolina's wedding, Nelle nozze della sorella Paolina, shows a Leopardi still operating in the mode of public classical verse, formal, addressed to a specific occasion, drawing on ancient models. But the emotional subtext is unmistakable. The poem urges Paolina toward a kind of resigned dignity in the face of a world that offers women even less than it offers men. It is not a cheerful wedding poem. It could not be, written by someone who was seeing the world as Leopardi was seeing it by 1823. He left Rome in the spring of 1823 and made his way back to Recanati. The city had failed to provide what he needed: intellectual companionship, genuine philosophical engagement, any evidence that the wider world contained more life than the world he had left behind. He came back to Recanati more pessimistic than he'd left. That was saying something, with a clearer sense than ever that the external world offered him nothing he hadn't already found in books. Back in Recanati, and increasingly unable to work on poetry because of his deteriorating eyes, Leopardi turned to prose. The decision was partly forced on him. Poetry, as he practiced it, demanded a quality of visual and imaginative concentration that his failing eyesight made increasingly difficult to sustain. Prose was more forgiving, at least in the mechanical sense. But what he produced between 1823 and 1827 was not a compromise or a retreat. It was something stranger and more original than almost anything his contemporaries were writing anywhere in Europe. He called them the operette morali, the small moral works. The title is almost deliberately understated. These are short pieces, many of them dialogues, some of them philosophical fables, a few of them lyrical meditations in prose. They're light on the surface. The form Leopardi chose draws visibly on two older traditions. There is Voltaire, the satirical wit, the ironic compression, the way a single exchange can detonate a large philosophical assumption. And there is Lucian, the 2nd century Greek satirist who wrote dialogues between gods and dead heroes, using the conventions of myth to expose the absurdity of human pretension. Leopardi knew both models intimately. He had read them in the original languages before most scholars his age could manage either. But what he built from these materials was something his predecessors would not have recognized. The darkness that runs through the operette is of a different order than Voltairean satire. Voltaire mocked human stupidity because he believed in something better. He had faith in reason, in progress, in the possibility of a more rational civilization. Leopardi had already thought his way past that faith. By 1823, he had concluded that reason itself was part of the problem, and that the civilization reason had built was a monument to suffering dressed up as advancement. The operette don't mock foolish institutions in the hope that better ones might replace them. They describe the structure of existence itself. Consider the dialogue between nature and an Icelander. The Icelander has travelled the entire world, searching for a place where life is bearable. Heat, cold, disease, accident, everywhere he goes, existence turns against him. He finally confronts nature directly and asks the obvious question, why? Nature's answer is remarkable in its candour. She doesn't claim to have designed human happiness. She doesn't offer consolation or explanation. She simply explains that human beings are not the point. She creates and destroys without purpose, attending to the continuation of the whole, while remaining entirely indifferent to the suffering of any part. The Icelander has no response to this. There isn't one. The dialogue ends with the Icelander presumably eaten by lions, which Leopardi describes almost as an afterthought. The exchange between the Earth and the Moon is quieter but equally bleak. The Earth asks the Moon what it observes looking down on human civilization across the centuries. The Moon's perspective is long and cold. Empires rise, philosophies replace one another, religions succeed religions, and the fundamental condition of human life remains unchanged. Nothing accumulates in the direction of happiness. The Moon reports this without cruelty. It is simply what observation reveals. Then there is the conversation between Tristan and a friend. Tristan being a character who speaks with Leopardi's own voice. He has read everything, thought everything through, and found no argument capable of answering his pessimism. His friend suggests various remedies: action, love, religious faith, the satisfactions of philosophy itself. Tristan disposes of each one carefully, not with contempt, but with a kind of exhausted precision. He isn't enjoying his conclusions. He would prefer to be wrong, but he can't find the error. What these pieces accomplish together is something quite specific. They dramatize the movement from what scholars would later call historical pessimism to cosmic pessimism. In the earlier phase, the enemy was human reason, and nature retained at least a residual dignity as something humanity had foolishly abandoned. By the time the operettes were written, that position had collapsed. Nature is no longer a distant mother whose intentions were once good. She is an indifferent mechanism. She produced consciousness as she produces everything else, without design, without consideration of what consciousness would experience once it arrived. The fact that consciousness suffers is not a problem nature is interested in solving. Suffering is simply what consciousness does. Leopardi published the first edition of the operette Morali in 1827. The reception was uneven in ways that are easy to understand in retrospect. In certain literary circles, the book was admired for its formal elegance, its classical precision, and its undeniable intelligence. Some readers recognized immediately that they were encountering something of unusual philosophical seriousness, but the work made a great many people deeply uncomfortable, and the Catholic establishment found it more than uncomfortable. It found it unacceptable. The interesting thing is that the operette are not polemical in any conventional sense. Leopardi does not argue against the existence of God. He does not mount a theological refutation or repeat the familiar moves of Enlightenment atheism. He does something more unsettling. He simply describes a world in which no evidence of providential care is visible. His nature operates without purpose. His moon observes without judgment. His Icelander receives no answer that a benevolent creator could have supplied. God is not attacked in these pages. God is absent from them, and the absence is more troubling than any argument could be. The Catholic censors understood the implication perfectly well. A universe described in enough detail, with enough honesty, without the insertion of divine purpose at any point, becomes a universe in which divine purpose has no obvious foothold. The operette were not, despite their surface playfulness, a young man's work. They were the conclusions of someone who had looked at every available source of hope and found each one wanting. In 1825, a publisher in Milan named Stella offered Leopardi paid work. He accepted before the letter had finished drying. The job was editorial, preparing classical texts, writing commentary, the kind of scholarly labour Leopardi could do without thinking. But the work itself was almost beside the point. What Stella was really offering him was an exit. After years of failed escapes and the tightened surveillance and the slow suffocation of the palazzo, Leopardi took it with both hands. Milan was nothing like Recanati. The city was the commercial and intellectual capital of northern Italy, home to publishers, journals, literary societies. The kind of argument about ideas that Leopardi had been conducting entirely in his own head for the better part of a decade. He arrived as a relative unknown. The early canti had circulated in limited editions. The operette was still being composed, but he carried letters of introduction and a reputation for extraordinary erudition that opened doors quickly. For the first time in his life, he was sitting across a table from people who had read the same books, who could contest his readings, who treated disagreement as a form of respect. It was disorienting. He had imagined this world for so long that encountering its actual texture, the noise of it, the vanity of it, the occasional genuine brilliance of it, required a kind of adjustment he hadn't anticipated. His health in Milan was unreliable. The northern climate didn't help. The same eye problems that had plagued him through the previous years returned periodically, limiting how much he could read. But he pushed through. He was meeting Alessandro Manzoni's circle, engaging with the debate between classicists and romanticists that was reshaping Italian literary culture. Discovering somewhat uncomfortably that his own position fit neither camp cleanly. He had always been sceptical of Romanticism's tendency toward vague feeling and national sentiment, but his defense of the classical tradition sat awkwardly alongside the increasingly radical conclusions of his own philosophy. The literary world of Milan noticed the tension and didn't quite know what to do with him. By 1826, he had moved to Bologna, and the city suited him better. The atmosphere was less frenetic. The intellectual company was more congenial. He found there a kind of sustained conversation that Milan's busier social life had made difficult. His collected versi appeared in 1826, and the volume brought him real attention. Not fame exactly, but the kind of serious recognition from serious readers that he had wanted since adolescence. He was being read now not as a curiosity from the provinces, but as a poet of genuine consequence. In Bologna, he also found something rarer, friendships that didn't require him to perform well-being he didn't feel. The letters from this period carry a different quality than the anguished correspondence of the Recanati years. The suffering hadn't diminished, but it had company. Florence came next, and it brought complications. The Florentine literary salons were sophisticated and well attended, and Leopardi entered them with his reputation preceding him. But Florence was also the centre of Italian Romanticism in a way that Milan wasn't. His resistance to its dominant assumptions made him a figure of interest and occasional friction. The operette Morali were published in their first edition in 1827, while he was moving between these cities. The reception confirmed what he had suspected. The work was admired by those who could tolerate its conclusions and deeply uncomfortable for those who couldn't. The Catholic intellectual establishment found the dialogues impossible to endorse. Certain liberal readers found them too dark to be useful. Leopardi watched the reactions and recorded his observations without much surprise. Then Pisa, in the winter of 1827 and into 1828. The milder climate of Tuscany's coast made a difference his body hadn't allowed him to feel for years. The eye trouble eased, the chronic pain receded slightly, and something he had feared was gone permanently returned: the capacity for lyric poetry. He had spent years producing prose because his deteriorating health made the sustained concentration required for verse too costly. In Pisa, without quite planning it, the poetry came back. The lyric he called Il Risorgimento, the resurgence, was written here. Its subject was exactly what its title suggested: the return of feeling, of imagination, of the possibility of being moved after a long winter he had begun to believe was permanent. It was not a triumphant poem. Leopardi didn't write triumphant poems, but it carried something warmer than resignation. It pointed toward the extraordinary work that would follow when he was forced once again to go home. These years of wandering gave him material, friendships, a brief flickering sense that life beyond Recanati might after all be livable. The transformation in Leopardi's philosophy that took hold around 1825 was not subtle. The earlier position, that nature had once been generous, that reason was the corrupter, that something valuable had been lost when civilization stripped away the ancient illusions, still held a kind of consolation inside it. It implied a wound that might, in some theoretical sense, have been avoided. By 1825, Leopardi had stopped believing that. Nature was not a careless mother who had let her children wander into danger. She was something colder than that, indifferent in her structure, mechanical in her operation. She had produced consciousness the way a volcano produces heat, without intention, without purpose, without any obligation to the things caught in the flow. The shift had been building for years. The failed escape of 1819, the months of near blindness, the Roman disappointment, the accumulated evidence of his own body, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion. Suffering was not an accident of history or a consequence of civilization's wrong turn. It was the basic condition. Nature had given human beings minds capable of desiring the infinite, and bodies capable of experiencing only the finite. She had done this without malice, which was somehow worse than malice would have been. Malice implies a relationship. Indifference implies nothing at all. This is where the theory of pleasure becomes essential. Leopardi's argument was precise and, once understood, very difficult to answer. The soul reaches always toward something absolute, toward complete happiness, toward permanent satisfaction, toward a joy that does not diminish and does not end. But every actual pleasure that exists is bounded. It arrives, it peaks, it fades. The gap between what desire reaches for and what the world can supply is not a gap that can be closed by better circumstances or better choices. It is structural. It is built into the relationship between consciousness and reality. A man who achieves everything he wanted is not finally happy. He simply discovers that what he wanted was not enough, that the wanting was always pointing past the thing wanted towards something further that has no name and no object. This is not a psychological problem that therapy could address. It is a philosophical condition, and it has no remedy. What distinguished Leopardi's pessimism from other dark philosophies circulating in Europe at the same moment was his absolute refusal of metaphysical explanation. Schopenhauer was arriving at comparable conclusions about suffering around this same period, working largely in parallel and, it appears, without significant cross-influence. Both men saw universal suffering as the foundational fact of existence, not an anomaly to be explained away. But Schopenhauer built a metaphysical architecture around that fact: the blind striving will, the transcendent principle behind all phenomena, the possibility of release through aesthetic contemplation, or ascetic renunciation. Leopardi had no patience for any of this. Evil, for him, was not a transcendent principle. It was an observation. It was what you found when you looked honestly at the world and stopped inventing reasons for what you saw. To construct a metaphysics of suffering was, in his view, a form of intellectual vanity. It dressed up an empirical fact in philosophical costume and pretended that explaining something was the same as resolving it. He was equally unsparing about the consolations that most people, including most philosophers, kept available to themselves. Religion promised redemption and suffered from the obvious problem that no evidence supported it. The Enlightenment myth of progress promised that reason and science would gradually improve the human condition. Leopardi found this not merely wrong, but almost comically optimistic, given what reason had actually produced in his own experience. Nationalism, which was building toward its great 19th century crescendo all around him, offered collective identity as a substitute for individual meaning. He had written the patriotic odes. He knew the feeling. It didn't hold, and yet illusions were necessary. This was the knot at the center of his mature thinking, and he never fully untied it. The ancient Greeks had been capable of genuine courage and genuine beauty, partly because they still had access to illusions that gave life a texture and density it otherwise lacked. The capacity for heroism, for passionate love, for the kind of unreflective vitality that produces great art. All of these required a certain blindness to the ultimate conditions of existence. The philosopher who had looked clearly at those conditions was, in a precise sense, less equipped for living than the peasant who had never looked at all. This was not a conclusion Leopardi reached with satisfaction. It put him in a position he could neither escape nor resolve. He had done the thinking. The thinking had cost him the capacity for illusion. No amount of philosophical sophistication could buy that capacity back. By his late 20s, he was writing about these questions with a calm that bordered on the clinical. The Zibaldoni pages from this period are dense, systematic, and almost entirely without self-pity. That is extraordinary, given what he was describing. He wasn't cataloguing abstract philosophical positions. He was describing his own life, the life of someone who had seen too clearly and too early, who had been too thorough in his pursuit of truth to leave himself anywhere soft to land. The conclusions were bleak. The method was scrupulous. Leopardi had arrived at a position bleaker than almost any thinker before him had publicly occupied. The remarkable thing was that he got there through careful observation rather than despair. In 1828, money ran out, and Leopardi came home. There was no dignified way to frame it. He had spent 3 years moving between Milan, Bologna, Florence, Pisa, 3 years of something approaching a normal intellectual life, of conversations with real equals, of a world that extended beyond the walls of the palazzo. And then the work dried up, the payments stopped, and the options narrowed to one. He returned to Recanati in November 1828, 30 years old, ill, dependent again on a father whose worldview he had long since left behind. The town received him exactly as it always had. Nothing had changed. That was the point of Recanati. Nothing ever changed. He knew what the return meant. It wasn't simply inconvenience or wounded pride. It was the confirmation of something he had been arguing philosophically for years, that the distance between desire and reality was not a temporary problem to be solved by effort or luck, but a permanent condition of existence. He had wanted freedom badly enough to plan an illegal escape in 1819. He had tasted something like it between 1825 and 1828, and now he was back in the same rooms, looking at the same walls, with the same body that had been failing him since his teens. The bitterness was not fresh. It had been aging for a long time. What was new was how completely the evidence had accumulated. But something happened in those rooms that no one, least of all Leopardi himself, could entirely have predicted. The confinement that felt like punishment produced poetry of a kind he had not written before. The wandering years had given him freedom and contact and publication. They had not given him his greatest work. Recanati did that. He wrote a Silvia in 1828, not long after the return. The poem is addressed to a young woman named Silvia, almost certainly Teresa Fattorini. The daughter of his father's coachman, who had died of tuberculosis years earlier when she was barely out of girlhood, Leopardi had known her slightly, as one knows someone who exists at the edge of a confined world. But her death had lodged somewhere in his thinking. Now, a decade later, it surfaced as one of the defining poems of the 19th century. The poem opens with memory. Silvia is recalled in the full brightness of her youth, her singing rising through the rooms of the house, her hands busy at the loom, her dark eyes full of a future she never reached. Leopardi places himself in those same remembered days, a young man poring over his books in the palazzo above, pausing to listen to her voice from the courtyard below. The two of them are held in the poem at the exact moment before knowledge arrives, the moment when youth still believes in the promises that youth makes to itself. She believed in her future. He believed briefly in his. Neither belief survived. The poem then turns. It simply moves forward in time, and time is enough. Silvia dies. The future she was moving toward closes before she reaches it. And in the final movement of the poem, Leopardi addresses her directly, asking whether this is what she died for, whether this is what nature promised and then withheld. Silvia becomes something larger than herself. She becomes the human tendency to hope, and the inevitability of that hope's destruction. She is every young person who looked forward and found nothing there. She is the illusion itself, dead of the same disease that kills everything that makes life bearable. The period that produced Silvia produced other poems of comparable weight. Le Ricordons, Memories, is a longer meditation on the same territory. The landscape of Recanati itself becoming the archive of everything lost. Every window and hill and night sky carrying the weight of past feeling that can never be recovered. La quiete dopo la tempesta, the calm after the storm, observes the particular quality of relief that follows a passing storm. A pleasure that exists only as the temporary absence of fear. That is precisely Leopardi's theory of happiness in concentrated form. Il sabato del villaggio, Saturday in the village, watches a community preparing for Sunday's festivities and finds in its happiness something already elegiac. This was because the anticipation of pleasure is always more vivid than the pleasure itself. Each of these poems takes a small observation, weather, memory, a village Saturday, and opens it into something philosophical without ever abandoning its particularity. They are not abstract arguments. They are events in the world that carry argument inside them. By 1830, friends in Florence, principally those who had come to know him during the wandering years, had arranged enough financial support to make another departure possible. In April of that year, Leopardi walked out of the palazzo at Recanati for the last time. The town had given him everything it was going to give him. The library, the suffering, and in the end, the poems. A Silvia was not a lament for one dead girl. It was a lament for everything beautiful that existed only to be destroyed. Reading it now, nearly 2 centuries later, that quality has not diminished by a syllable. The friendship that finally got Leopardi out of Recanati for good had begun in Florence, when he met a young Neapolitan named Antonio Ranieri. The exact circumstances of the meeting place, it's somewhere in the Florence literary circuit, around 1828 to 1830, when Leopardi was living in the city on what remained of his modest external support. Ranieri was 23 years old. He was physically robust, socially confident, genuinely charming in the way that Leopardi had never been and could never be. The contrast between them was difficult to miss. Ranieri was handsome, energetic, capable of moving through drawing rooms with an ease that came naturally to men whose bodies cooperated with them. He was also, at this point in his life, in political trouble. a committed liberal nationalist. He'd been exiled from Naples for his views and was living in the north under the kind of cloud that gave certain young men in post-Napoleonic Italy a glamorous edge. He was precisely the type that Florence's intellectual circles admired. What drew him to Leopardi is the question that scholars have been circling for nearly 2 centuries. The simplest explanation is the obvious one. Leopardi's reputation, even then, was extraordinary among those who knew Italian letters well. The canti had circulated. The operette morali had made an impression on readers who could handle what they were actually saying. Meeting Leopardi in person, however, was a different experience. He was 30 years old in 1828. His body already showed the full cost of 2 decades of illness and privation. He moved with difficulty. His spine had curved badly enough to alter his posture and his gait. He was, by every account, a striking and slightly shocking figure to encounter. This mind of enormous vitality, housed in a frame that had been quietly failing since adolescence. Ranieri claimed, then and afterward, that the devotion he felt was immediate and sincere. There is no particular reason to doubt this entirely, though there are plenty of reasons to examine it carefully. The friendship deepened fast. By 1830, when Leopardi finally secured enough support from friends in Florence to leave Recanati for the last time, Ranieri was already functioning as something between a companion and a caretaker. Leopardi's letters from this period reveal what he himself felt. They reveal a man who had never in his life experienced consistent human warmth directed specifically at him, who was correspondingly defenseless against it. The emotional dependence that comes through in those letters is not subtle. He writes of Ranieri with a tenderness and a reliance that he had never directed toward anyone outside his siblings. It was something close to total attachment, with everything that implies about vulnerability. What Ranieri actually felt is harder to establish. Later in his life, long after Leopardi was dead, he would write about the friendship with a proprietary intensity that struck many readers as self-serving. He had managed Leopardi's papers, Leopardi's reputation, Leopardi's narrative. Scholars in the 20th century began asking whether Ranieri's account of his own devotion was accurate, or whether it had been shaped over decades into something more flattering than the original. The honest answer is that nobody knows. What is clear is that during the Florence years, the arrangement functioned. Ranieri was present, attentive, willing to organize his own life around Leopardi's needs to a degree that no one else had ever done. The practical circumstances of those years were difficult. Money was always scarce. Leopardi's health continued its slow deterioration. His eyesight remained unreliable. His digestive problems and chronic pain made sustained work exhausting. And yet the work continued. He prepared texts, maintained his correspondence, and kept the Zibaldone growing. Florence offered him intellectual company that Recanati had never provided. Even in poor health, he was capable of contributing to conversations that the city's literary circles valued. He was not merely a figure to be cared for. He was still, unmistakably, a mind in full operation. By 1833, the situation shifted again. The Neapolitan government issued a pardon for Ranieri, which meant he could return home. For a man who had been living in political exile for years, this was not a small thing. He intended to go south. The question was what Leopardi would do. His health made travel difficult, and Naples, in every practical sense, was a poor environment for someone with his respiratory and circulatory problems. The climate was warm, but the city was enormous and chaotic, and far from any of the northern connections that had sustained his literary life. None of this produced significant hesitation. Leopardi followed Ranieri south with what, given the circumstances, looks like the decision of a man who had attached himself completely to one person and was unwilling to remain behind. In 1833, Leopardi and Ranieri left for Naples together, and Leopardi would never return north again. Naples was everything Recanati was not: loud, chaotic, warm, absolutely indifferent to the suffering of any individual caught within it. The city in the 1830s was the largest in Italy, a sprawling Mediterranean port of somewhere near 400,000 people, where fishermen, merchants, priests, street vendors occupied the same narrow alleys in a press of noise and smell that had no equivalent anywhere in the Papal States. Leopardi had spent his formative years in a town of a few thousand souls, surrounded by silence and hills. Naples was the opposite of everything that had shaped him. He knew it from the moment he arrived. He settled into a household with Ranieri and Ranieri's sister, Paolina, who took on the practical management of Leopardi's daily existence with a devotion that went well beyond ordinary hospitality. His health by this point required genuine tending. The spinal condition had long since bent and compressed his frame. His eyesight was unreliable. He tired quickly, moved with difficulty, and could not always be left alone. Paolina organised meals, managed the domestic arrangements, ensured that the household functioned in ways that allowed Leopardi to work when he was able. Without her, it is hard to see how the final years would have been possible at all. What is remarkable is how much he did produce, given the physical circumstances. The correspondence continued. Letters went out to friends in Florence and Milan, responses to critics, exchanges with scholars who had read the operette and wanted to argue about them. He prepared the 1835 collected edition of his work, revising poems that had appeared in scattered forms over the previous 15 years and organising them into the Canti, the collection that would eventually be recognised as one of the landmarks of Italian literature. He added new pieces. He continued the philosophical engagements that had occupied him since his teens. The body was failing in ways that were impossible to ignore, but the mind had not softened. He was never entirely comfortable. In Naples, the intellectual climate struck him as shallower than Florence. The city's energy, which might have invigorated another man, remained alien to someone whose entire inner life had been built in stillness and solitude. He was not unhappy, exactly, but he was never at home there either. The gap between the world outside his window and the world inside his head was perhaps wider in Naples than it had ever been. Then in 1836, cholera reached the city. The epidemic was serious enough to drive many households out of Naples and into the surrounding countryside. Ranieri moved the household south to Torre del Greco, a town on the Bay of Naples that sat in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. The volcano loomed over everything there. It was not a benign presence. Vesuvius had buried Herculaneum and Pompeii in 79 AD, and it had erupted many times since. The landscape around its base was scarred and strange. Blackened lava fields, thin soil. Growing on those slopes almost defiantly, the yellow broom plant, the ginestra, flowering against a backdrop of hardened destruction. Leopardi looked at this landscape and wrote his last major poem. La Ginestra is long by his standards, over 300 lines, divided into 7 sections, addressed directly to the broom plant growing on the volcano's slopes. It is the furthest thing from the compressed 15-line meditations of L'Infinito. This is a poem that argues, at length, with considerable force, with barely contained fury, at the delusions it identifies in contemporary thought. Leopardi attacks 2 targets in particular. The first is religious consolation, the belief that human suffering has divine meaning, that pain is purposeful, that a benevolent God presides over the catastrophes of human existence. The second is the 19th century's faith in progress, the Enlightenment descended belief that civilization was advancing, that human life was improving, that the arc of history bent toward better things. For Leopardi, both positions were forms of lying to oneself. The broom plant is his counter-argument. It grows on the slopes of a volcano without illusion. It does not pretend that its situation is safe. It does not invoke providence or progress to explain why it blooms in the shadow of something that will eventually destroy it. It simply flowers briefly and makes no false claims about what it is doing or why. Leopardi calls this honesty, The plant is, in some sense, wiser than the philosophers and priests who insist on finding meaning in a universe that has given no evidence of caring whether we find meaning or not. But the poem does not end in pure negation. What it offers instead is solidarity, the recognition that suffering is universal, that every human life is conducted under the same conditions of limitation, pain. Mortality should, Leopardi argues, produce not despair, but a kind of fraternity. If we know that everyone around us is carrying the same weight, the rational response is compassion, not competition. Courage in the face of shared vulnerability is not heroism. It is simply what honesty requires. This was not a comfortable conclusion. It offered no heaven, no historical redemption, no guarantee that the suffering would be worth something in the end. What it offered was accurate, and for Leopardi, accuracy had always been the only standard that mattered. La Ginestra was the last major thing Leopardi wrote. It said what everything else had been building toward. Solidarity was not happiness, but it was the only honest response to the human condition. By the summer of 1837, Leopardi was barely leaving his bed. The dropsy that had been advancing for months had swollen his legs so severely that walking had become almost impossible. His breathing came in laboured intervals. The body that had been failing him since his early teens was now failing him in ways that could not be managed, compensated for, or ignored. He was 38 years old. Ranieri was there throughout. He and his sister, Paolina, had organised the household around Leopardi's needs for years, and by the final months, those needs had become almost entirely medical. Leopardi's correspondence had slowed to almost nothing. The man who had produced thousands of pages of philosophical prose, who had filled the Zibaldone across 15 years, who had still been revising his collected canti as recently as 1835, was now too weak to sustain the intellectual work that had defined every hour of his conscious life. That silence was its own kind of death, arriving before the other one did. June 14th came on quickly. The deterioration that morning was faster than anything the previous weeks had suggested. Ranieri stayed beside him. The breathing that had been laboured grew worse and then it stopped. Leopardi died sometime that afternoon in the house they shared in Naples. He was 38 years, 11 months and 15 days old. His body had outlasted his health by roughly 2 decades, which was itself a kind of testament to something. Stubbornness, perhaps, or the sheer force of the mind that had kept it moving. The burial arrangements that followed were chaotic in ways that felt almost deliberately cruel. Cholera had been moving through Naples and its surrounding areas, and authorities were applying strict protocols to the dead. There were real concerns that Leopardi's body might be disposed of in a mass grave without ceremony. Ranieri intervened urgently, pressing contacts and pleading with officials. He managed to secure a burial at the church of San Vitale a Fuorigrotta outside the city proper. It was not the resting place of a great man being honoured. It was the outcome of a bureaucratic struggle in a city preoccupied with epidemic disease. The death notices were short. A few journals noted the passing of a poet and philologist from Recanati. The fuller appreciations were limited to the small circles that had known his work closely. Italy, in the summer of 1837, was occupied with other things. The Risorgimento was still forming itself. Political pressures were building across the peninsula. A sickly poet dying in a rented house in Naples was not an event that commanded widespread attention. He had been obscure for most of his life, and he died obscure. His unpublished manuscripts remained in disarray for months after his death. Friends who had known him in various cities, Rome, Florence, Pisa, possessed fragments of his work and his letters, scattered testimonies of his intellectual life. These materials would eventually form the basis of what scholars could recover and study. Ranieri outlived him by decades. He was still alive when Leopardi's reputation had transformed beyond anything either of them could have anticipated in 1837. He wrote about his friend at length, producing a memoir that portrayed their relationship and Leopardi's final years in ways that later scholars would examine with considerable care. Ranieri had managed the manuscripts, the correspondence, the literary estate, and he had shaped the early narrative of who Leopardi was and what his life had meant. Some of what he wrote has been confirmed by other sources, some of it has not. The question of what Ranieri gave Leopardi in those final years and what he took in return has never been settled to everyone's satisfaction. The city moved on without pausing, as cities do, and the man who had spent his entire life thinking about the indifference of the universe died into exactly that indifference. The obituaries were brief, and most of Italy did not notice. A small death notice appeared in a Neapolitan paper. A few literary journals acknowledged the loss. The Canti had been admired by a circle of readers who understood what they were looking at. But that circle was not large. The operette morale had made certain readers deeply uneasy, and the church had made its disapproval known. For most educated Italians in 1837, Leopardi was a melancholy provincial poet of some distinction, not a figure whose death required the nation to stop and take stock. The Risorgimento changed that, though not entirely honestly. The nationalists of the mid-19th century, building toward Italian unification, needed poets who had burned with patriotic feeling. Leopardi had written exactly those poems in 1818. All Italia and the Ode to Dante were there in the record, unmistakable in their longing for Italian greatness. So the Risorgimento claimed him. They quoted the early odes at rallies and in pamphlets. What they set carefully aside was everything that came after: the cosmic pessimism, the indifferent nature, the dialogues in which every human consolation collapses under examination. You couldn't easily conscript a man into nationalist mythology when his mature philosophy held that all collective hopes were illusions. The solution was to read the early Leopardi and treat the rest as a private affliction rather than a philosophical conclusion. It was a convenient reading, and it lasted longer than it should have. The fuller reckoning came gradually. Nietzsche read Leopardi with genuine admiration, recognizing in him a predecessor who had arrived at similar conclusions about reason, illusion, the poverty of modern civilization, and had done so without metaphysical scaffolding. That last point mattered. Schopenhauer explained universal suffering through the blind, striving will, a transcendent principle driving all existence toward futility. Leopardi refused that move entirely. Suffering, in his account, required no metaphysical explanation because it was an empirical observation. You didn't need a theory of the will to explain that the world caused pain. You only needed to look. Nietzsche, who was building his own critique of optimism and progress and the comfortable lies of European culture, found that refusal of false explanation genuinely important. Two men arriving at darkness from different directions and recognizing each other across the gap. The 19th century's broader crisis of faith gave Leopardi's work an audience it hadn't had during his lifetime. As the century wore on and the assumptions of Enlightenment progress came under increasing pressure, the questions Leopardi had been asking since his teens started to look less like personal misery and more like accurate diagnosis. He had written, decades before Darwin, before the full collapse of providential certainty, about a universe indifferent to human wishes. He had described the gap between what the mind desires and what existence provides, with a precision that felt prophetic to later readers who were living through exactly that gap on a civilizational scale. Italian literature absorbed him slowly and sometimes awkwardly. D'Annunzio is the strange negative image, the poet who took the lyrical intensity and the obsession with beauty and stripped out the philosophical honesty, replacing Leopardi's hard clarity with theatrical self-glorification. Where Leopardi refused consolation, D'Annunzio manufactured it wholesale, wrapping nationalism and aestheticism in language that glittered without illuminating anything. Reading them together clarifies what Leopardi was, because D'Annunzio shows you exactly what he wasn't. The 20th century found Leopardi again through the modernist poets and writers who were trying to work in a world after the war. After the grand narratives had failed, his insistence that there were no redemptive structures underlying human suffering, that the honest response was not transcendence, but solidarity, mapped onto a century that had seen enough of transcendent claims to be done with them. The Zibaldoni was a different kind of discovery. The complete text had been known to Italian scholars for a long time, but its full translation into English didn't appear until 2013. When it did, the reception was something close to astonishment. Readers expecting a conventional journal found instead nearly 5,000 pages of systematic philosophical inquiry, aesthetics, linguistics, the psychology of perception, the mechanics of desire, the sociology of ancient cultures, the relationship between sound and meaning in poetry. It was not a notebook, it was an observatory. What struck readers most forcefully was how modern the method was, not the conclusions, which were unmistakably his, but the way he built them. He proceeded from observation to inference, checked inference against observation, refused to generalize further than his evidence supported, acknowledged when the evidence pulled against his preferred conclusions. For a man working alone in a provincial library, with no institutional support and no academic interlocutors, the rigor was remarkable. The Zibaldoni established Leopardi for an international audience that had largely received him only as a poet. It was one of the 19th century's most systematic philosophical minds. The question his readers keep returning to is whether any of this is useful. A philosophy that tells you happiness is structurally impossible, that nature is indifferent, that every consolation is an illusion. What do you do with that? The easy answer is that you find it depressing and set it aside, but that answer depends on confusing honesty with nihilism. And Leopardi was not a nihilist. He loved beauty. He loved language with a precision and tenderness that runs through every line he wrote. He believed, by the end, in solidarity, in the idea that people who share a condition of suffering have an obligation to each other, that the only honest response to the indifference of the universe is human compassion freely given. La Ginestra, his last major poem, doesn't end in despair. It ends with broom flowers growing on a volcano slope, fragile and temporary, and entirely without illusions about their situation. Leopardi holds them up as a model, not because their situation is good, but because they face it without lying about it. 3 centuries of readers have kept returning to him, not in spite of his darkness, but because of it. He tells them something they already suspected and couldn't quite say. He takes the experience of suffering, private, physical, intellectual, the specific suffering of a mind that can see exactly what it's missing and knows it will never have it, and shows that this experience, looked at with enough honesty and enough care, becomes something that belongs to everyone. He didn't solve the problem of human suffering. He showed us, with more precision and more honesty than almost anyone before or since, exactly what the problem was. It turns out that's enough to last.